Death wakes people up. The closer it gets, the more awake and aware we become. When the end draws near, we suddenly start thinking, what the hell am I doing? Why did I wait this long? Until then, most of us go through life as if we had all the time in the world. That is an excerpt from the book that I want to be talking to you guys about today on the second book club podcast, the second episode of the book club podcast, rather, on the Baird Retirement Management Show. And the book that we're going to be going over today is the one we referenced last time, which is a book called Die with Zero, and it's by Bill Perkins. On the Get to Know You episode that we did with Hannah, I talked about a good measure of the books that people really truly enjoy are the books that they recommend most to other people. So that would be a revealed preference rather than just an expressed preference. So people might say, oh, I love the Brothers Karamazov, but they probably haven't actually read it. So Die with Zero, it's a quick read. It's one of the books that I do highly recommend. I keep extra copies. I've given a few away. And I was actually rereading this book. And I think it probably, I want to be frank with the listener. This could be an emotional episode for Hannah and I, because the weird thing about life is, as I was rereading this book and preparing my notes for this podcast, a friend of ours passed away. And she passed away as complications from cancer treatment. But she was 40. Married. She had kids. And the existing schema or picture that Hannah and I shared of this friend of ours in our heads was she was vibrant. She was doing all the right things. She was an Ironman athlete. She was doing CrossFit. She was doing weightlifting. She was a force for good in the community. And she served as basically a college mom for both Hannah and I. And what's funny is when I reflected on that time of my life, I considered this person to be old. Because she seemed so well established in life. She had kids and she was in her early 30s. So this is a person who life was taken away from her quite suddenly. And we really did some deep thinking when it came to her funeral and celebrating the life that she had lived, and how tragic it was that there were going to be so many experiences that she had deferred that she was no longer going to have as a consequence of this kind of black swan event in her life. So that gave a little bit more meaning to the book that we're going through, Die with Zero by Bill Perkins. So let's jump in. Kind of like the last book we did, Happy Money, where Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Norton shared their 5 principles for spending. Bill has 9 principles for living a more fulfilling life. Now, the first 3, I'm going to kind of unify those as we walk through them, because it's more of an introduction to his philosophy rather than actionable steps that you might take. They're more ethereal than that. So we'll go through that, and then we'll kind of point by point cover, that would be principles 4 through 9, because those are going to be something that you can take action on like tomorrow morning as an example. So principles 1 through 3, these are optimize your life, invest in experiences, and then why die with zero. And like I said, this is more of an introduction to the Die with Zero philosophy. And our routine listeners, hey Cam, hey Mom, you're going to recall from the Happy Money podcast that one of the best ways you can improve your life with your money was to invest in experiences. So the notes that I took in this section of the book was, as a financial advisor, it is literally my job to be an advocate for sound financial decision making, for adequate savings rates, tax optimization, adequate insurance coverage, and in retirement, safe withdrawal rates. But this isn't where my advocacy ends. I'm an advocate for clients discovering whatever it is that makes them happy and then helping them convert their money into those experiences. The backdrop of this advocacy, of course, is the expertise and the experience that I've accumulated in my career that allows me and our team here at Baird to work with our clients to help them achieve these dreams prudentially and with confidence. Okay? So Bill's book is not some subtle approval of a YOLO lifestyle. Engineers, and Bill's training was as an engineer, and our client base is largely engineers, they deplore that kind of thinking. This is more of a optimization problem. And so what Bill is getting at here when he's saying invest in experiences, die with zero, that kind of thing, that's just one variable in what is a long equation as to what makes a life meaningful. Obviously, you have to have money. Obviously, you probably need some expert advice on how to best spend that money. But the Die with Zero philosophy, I want to make sure that the listener hears this. This is not you only live once, live like you're going to die tomorrow. That's really not what he's getting at. really the philosophy is embedded in three resources that we all have, but that are limited. And so Bill is going to talk consistently about balancing our money, our time, and our health. And one of the first points that he makes is, what good is your wealth if you don't have health? So nobody would trade their health or relative youth for money. Well, no sane person would. So we all like to ogle over the amount of money that, say, a guy like Warren Buffett has accumulated over his life. It's rather convenient that we can kind of suspend our knowledge of him being almost 95 years old. And the way that I like to think about this is I line my Gregs up from where I am today, so I'm 32, to all the way to when I hope to die, which would be call it 100. And then if you could think about this as how much would you pay or how much would you ask from a future Greg in order for you to swap ages with him, okay? So maybe I'd be willing to take just a couple $100s to be 33, but to be 93, there's no amount of money that I would trade to go from being 32 to 93 overnight. There's just no sum of money. So that's one of the things that Bill's going to get at here is, while you're young and relatively vital, you want to make sure that you're investing in experiences while you can most enjoy them, because when your time and when your health is starting to run thin, no amount of money is going to assuage those realities. Okay, so that's kind of like the very beginning of his philosophy is, we have a limited amount of time on this earth, and for some people, tragically, it's shorter than others, and we don't really know when that day is going to come. And weirdly enough, Bill begins his book with a story of a young couple who the husband in this couple gets diagnosed with cancer, and he passes away something like 3 months after the diagnosis. And from the charred remains of the life that they had together, the spouse makes a lot of significant changes for herself, because she chooses to live a life more in line with this die with zero philosophy as a consequence of that. So not advocating for anybody to live as if they're going to die tomorrow, but to appreciate the fact that we are all mortal, no one gets out of here alive, and we do have a limited time over which we can have these phenomenal experiences while we're healthy, okay? So like I talked about, Bill goes pretty heavy on what we already saw in Happy Money with buying experiences, and this is going to couple kind of two ideas. The first of which is buying experiences rather than things, and the second of which is a fancy economic or economist term called consumption smoothing. And I'm going to get into that a little bit here, but I want to read kind of my thoughts on what Bill was saying about buying these experiences. He says, buying experiences allows for a steady stream of memory dividends. And I want to avoid this podcast as coming across as our clients having lived very miserly lives up to the point that they're now retiring. That's not the case. Retirement is kind of a revitalization of this philosophy, because it's a distinct, as Mo in the previous episode, as he talked about, it's got to be a paradigm shift in your thinking. So while you're young and you have a lot of time, that's great. But while you're retired, it's not like you've not made experiences and had great memories with your children and the things that you've done until that time, but you are tasked now all of a sudden with living out this last part of your life and doing so in a way that will allow you to accumulate or optimize the experiences that you're going to have now that you're retired and now flush with a little bit more time and maybe even flush with a little bit more money. This is the philosophy that's going to allow you to get the most out of that time. So he's going to go on here, and it's saying and talk about how when you get to the end of your life, and this was the quote, I don't think it's from Bill himself, but it says, the real business of life is the acquisition of great memories. In the end, that is all there is. That's what he's saying, is when you get to the end of your life and you no longer have your health and you no longer have time, the thing that's going to be sustaining you, because you're not going to be able to spend your money doing the things that you could have done while you were younger, are only going to be the memories that you made when you had the body, when you had the mind, when you had the time in order to actually do those things. And so kind of like sequence risk tells us that the order in which we receive returns matters a lot for your financial health. Bill's argument in the first section here, when he's talking about optimizing your life and investing in experiences, is there is a very specific order in which we can experience things in life. And one of the anecdotes he tells is he was in his 50s and he was invited out to go wakeboarding with a couple of friends, and he hemmed and he hawed a little bit, talking about, I don't know if I really want to do that. And he thought to himself, well, realistically, this might be the last time that I'm going to have an opportunity to do this, where my knees and my back and all the rest of my appendages are going to be healthy enough to where not only I can wakeboard and legitimately stand up and get pulled behind a speedboat, but where I'll actually get any kind of utility or enjoyment out of it. So in optimizing our life, he really wants to make sure that people get the order of operations correct. And that's where consumption smoothing kind of comes in. Consumption smoothing is just a really fancy way of describing the trajectory of a person's life from an income perspective and an experience perspective. So this is what I mean by that. Bill's argument is that your income, if you're employed in a more traditional workplace, probably is only going to move up and to the right. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have some emergency reserves for gaps in employment, which happen fairly frequently. That doesn't mean that you might not ever take a pay cut to, say, go work at a slightly different job in a slightly different industry that has a promise of higher future earnings. But what it does mean is for most people, when you're young and just starting out in your career, you're going to be flush with time, perhaps, because particularly if you don't have children or if you're not married, you're going to be very vital because you're young, but you might not have a lot of money. And so what Bill says is you shouldn't be all that concerned right at the beginning of your career about your savings rate. And what he means by that is you can borrow some money, quote unquote, from your future self, because your future self is inevitably, for most people, going to be earning some more money. So his point is, rather than holding down the experiences that you're going to have in your 20s and 30s and waiting for you to have the actual money to pay for them, like in cash right away, maybe in your 40s and 50s, he thinks that's kind of a foolish way to go about doing it, because you're going to have a lot of excess capital later in life that you're not going to be able to use if you continue to defer these experiences into the future. So consumption smoothing says, rather than deferring experiences for later and later in life and then trying to have them all at once when you feel like you have the money to do it, you should smooth out your consumptions of those costly experiences by maybe taking on a little bit more debt in your early years and satisfying that debt and raising your savings rate over time as you're earning more money. So that is kind of his introduction into his philosophy. And then in a more retirement-centric way, I wanted to revisit a little bit of advice that Mo gave our listener at the end of the episode that we did with him. And I thought it was a beautiful example because it was so simple, but it was very meaningful. So Mo tells his clients to divide a standard sheet of paper right down the middle. On the left, write down in as much detail, no matter how trivial, the things that you dislike doing, the daily frictions, the stuff you didn't wish, or the stuff that you wish you didn't have to do in retirement. Be brutally honest and precise. And then on the right-hand side, write the things that you want to do in retirement. Spare no detail. Allow yourself to really think through what sort of life you would like to live. You are, like most people, resource constrained to a certain degree, so consider this. But now the whole goal, as Mo tells his clients, is to figure out how you can do fewer of the things that populate the left side of this paper and more of the things that populate the right. And this might seem like a kind of hanky exercise to put people through. It's like dream casting or whatever. I don't think it is. I think that this forces a person to grapple with the fact that they're going to be doing a lot of things in retirement that they weren't doing while they were working because they were out of the house for, 8 to 10 hours a day. And you're going to have to fill that time with something. And I think Mo's point is you want that something to be in your control. You don't just want to go on autopilot and discover, wow, now I'm spending 4 or 5 hours a day watching television, and that isn't really the retirement that I had pictured for myself. Or, wow, taking the trash out, mowing the lawn, cleaning the gutters, redoing the roof. These are things that when I was in my 20s and 30s, I felt very comfortable doing. But now that I'm in my 50s and perhaps 60s, I don't like doing this as much. I don't want to spend my time doing that. And you owe it to yourself to just at least investigate how you might go about removing some of those daily frictions from your life, which would allow yourself to enjoy your retirement that much more. And linking back to the Happy Money episode, that's a really good way to buy back some of your time in retirement. And I think that this is something that we kind of got into at the end of the last episode with Mo, which was a sort of insidious dichotomy exists in our work as financial advisors. The clients who enter the retirement best positioned to retire, so these are the people who have accumulated a large asset base and they don't really spend that much money. These are very well likely to be people who are type A, diligent, conscientious planners. These are people who are hyper aware of costs and they deplore financial inefficiencies. They closely monitor investments and are not pleased with underperformance. These people, who are best set up to fully enjoy their retirement, often find it difficult to do so. They can't, like flipping a switch, or as Mo called it, a paradigm shift, suddenly become spenders. They can't imagine doing things just to do them. And I think I suffer from this affliction myself. I find it difficult to not view everything as some sort of investment, whether or not how it's spending my time, we're spending our money. A lot of these type A individuals think about things as there always needs to be some need to do it, as if they're fulfilling some goal. They can't just go for a walk. It's, I'm getting my 10,000 steps. They can't just enjoy a sunrise. It's, I'm getting early morning sunlight to set my circadian rhythms right so I can sleep better tonight. They can't just go on a trip. The trip has to be optimized. It has to be like, well, we're doing this for the cultural experience. It's not for fun. There's no room for fun when you're a type A person for most people. But so for people like in this position, these are the people for whom we are desperately trying for them to try a couple of new things, spend a little bit more money, do the things that they want to do in their retirement while they're young, rather than listening to, Warren Buffett saying rule number 1 is never lose money. Rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. Or Charlie Munger, who said never needlessly interrupt compounding. Or Albert Einstein said that compound interest was the 8th wonder of the world. That's all well and good. And I think that there is definitely some things to be gained from that. But when you retire and when you are in that active phase of your retirement, part of what we do as financial advisors is empower people to spend money doing the things that they actually want to do. Okay? So that kind of block of what we just went through, which was optimizing your life, investing in experiences rather than things, creating those memory dividends, and why it is that a person should approach this philosophy of dying with zero, that's really just an introduction to the philosophy. The next principles out of the 9, so the next 6 principles, these are going to be a little bit more granular. These are going to be things that you might consider actually doing rather than just things that you're going to be thinking about. And the first of which is Bill, who is not a financial advisor, he's not a person who's going to sell you anything. He introduces the concept of how can we get people to more comfortably part with their money. And this was, again, something that I had talked about briefly in the Happy Money episode, which was the kind of annuity mystery, which is why are people not allocating more of their capital to annuities to cover some of their baseline expenses, even though there's a lot of data demonstrating that people who do that enjoy their retirement slightly more because they're free from that anxiety of running out of money and having to rely on family. So Bill says, one of the first steps in figuring out how to best die with zero is to confront your inevitable mortality and be ruthless in your assessment of your likely lifespan. Do you have longevity in your family? Are you already contending with health issues? Do you take care of yourself? Do you wear a seatbelt? Do you smoke? Do you ride a motorcycle? Do you drink to excess? Do you have a healthy body weight? Do you exercise regularly? Are you embedded in a community that fosters meaningful relationships? It isn't easy, but this is the necessary work that you need to do if you intend on getting the most out of your time and out of your money. Ignorance will not be bliss here. In the book, Bill actually gives you a few tools that you can use to assess what your likely life expectancy is. And his point is, if you can't figure out what the end point is going to be, you're really not going to be able to optimize how you spend your time between now and the end of your life. So he takes a bit of a macabre approach to this, where he actually has a countdown on his phone to what he presumes will be the last year of his life, and that serves as a constant reminder to him that says, here's how much time you've got left on this earth. You're going to go this way but once. Make sure that you're spending this time wisely. My thoughts on the annuity puzzle were as follows. A curious bit of research has been done on annuities. I'm not here to sell you an annuity. Like all financial instruments, annuities may or may not be suitable for your situation. I think a lot of literature on annuities, especially the literature pushed by personal financial gurus, is that there is never a reason to buy an annuity, and that all annuities are sold by shady salespeople looking to earn commissions. All right, let's set that debate aside for a second. JP Morgan did some actual research on consumption patterns and how they differ between households that have an annuity, which is really just a source of income they can never outlive, and those that do not. Households that had annuities tended to spend more on average, and this is the really interesting part for our purposes here, they tended to feel better about their spending. Okay, so not only were they spending more of their capital, and this doesn't mean they were doing so in a way that was going to jeopardize their retirement. That's not what the research demonstrated. It just showed that they were consuming a little bit more of it, probably because they felt empowered to do so, because they knew that their baseline income needs, this would be their housing, their utilities, their gas and groceries, their health insurance, things like that, those were being covered by a guaranteed source of income. And what that allowed them to do in most cases was they could invest the remaining part of their money a little bit more aggressively, because they knew that they had this floor of income that they could never outlive from an insurance company. And that more aggressive investment, in many cases, particularly over a long enough period of time, gave them a little bit more money to do excess spending with. Because remember, everything that the people that they studied were spending in excess of what their annuity was paying them, that was just on conspicuous consumption. That was just on things that they wanted to do rather than things that they felt like they needed to have covered in order to live the life that they wanted to live in retirement. So think extra vacations, more dinners out, that more, I would say, more charitable giving, more giving money or more spending on their friends and family. This is the kind of spending that the households that had an annuity were doing, and they felt better about it. And so this was something covered by Richard Thaler, who is a behavioral economist, or he's really in the behavioral finance space. They call it the annuity puzzle. And a lot of people who study annuities and how they work cannot figure out why more retirees are not allocating at least a portion of their capital to a stream of income that they can never outlive. And not all annuities are created equal. And like I said before, I'm not here to sell you an annuity, but I am very interested in employing products in our financial portfolios or in our financial plans that allow or empower clients to spend more of their money and to do so free from anxiety. And that's probably what the annuity is providing. Interestingly enough, Stephen Dubner, who is most famous for his work with Stephen Levitt, and they wrote Freakonomics, they've noted that, and I don't know if they controlled for all the other factors here, households that have an annuity actually live longer than those who don't. Now, of course, you're probably thinking to yourself, correlation and causation, they're not the same thing. And maybe the reason that these households have annuities is because they already thought that they would live longer. I'm willing to submit that that's certainly a distinct possibility. I just found it curious that households that own an annuity, they spend a little bit more money, they get some more enjoyment out of spending that money, they spend it more comfortably, and they tend to live longer. That sounds like something that I might be interested in doing. Okay, so households that had annuities tend to spend more on average, and this is a really interesting part. Yeah, they got a little bit more enjoyment out of that. Why might that be? And then they did a little bit more research and says 2 groups of people were observed. One group was told that at some point in time they would receive an electric... Okay, so this goes on to why I think that this might be, and this was from another experiment about how it is that we experience anxiety about unknown events in the future. So they divided these groups of people into 2. One group of people were their control group. They measured their sweat output, all the sort of hormones that would indicate they were under any stress. And then another group was the experimental group. And these people were told that with varying degrees of probability, they would receive an electric shock. Now, this shock was not fatal, but it was uncomfortable, okay? And they wanted to see when they told people, hey, you've got a 50% chance of receiving an electric shock, you've got a 40, a 30, a 20, a 10, a 5, whether or not their stress hormone levels would vary as the probability of being shocked went down, okay? So you can imagine you were told you have a 50% chance of being an electric shock. That's pretty stressful. You think, well, there's a coin flip, I'm probably going to get shocked. But the curious finding here was they could not reduce that probability down enough to make the hormone or stress response decrease, okay? What does that mean? That meant if you were told you had a 50% chance of being electrocuted or a 1% chance of being electrocuted, your response at the physiologic level, at the stress hormone level, was the same. Okay? It was the same. Now, we run into this issue with some of our retirees, right? And they want a financial plan that is 100% bulletproof. They want to make sure that there's no chance of them running out of money. And I think that for some people, being told that, well, based on a Monte Carlo analysis, your financial plan indicates that you will have enough money to live a 30-year retirement in 87% of cases. That's a really good score. Based on the uncertainty that is absolutely inevitable with investing in the stock market, having an 87% probability of success in retirement is a really good score, particularly because they use some rather onerous assumptions. And that does not mean you ran out of money. It means you continued spending that money year over year, never changing your behavior until you couldn't spend the money that you wanted to spend any longer. A very unrealistic set of assumptions. What I find interesting about this is the annuity might be a similar deal as reducing that chance of electric shock to zero. Because if you allocate some of your capital to a product that's going to cover your basic income needs for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live, maybe that's really the thing that is like, okay, we can take a breath, because no matter what, we're going to get this paycheck on a monthly or annual basis, and we're going to be able to keep the lights on. We're not going to have to go to our family. We're not going to have to go on Medicaid. That might be what's allowing people to live their retirement a little bit more free of anxiety. And I think that, again, I'm not here to sell you anything, but if that's a conversation you want to have with your advisor, I think just based on the research that they've done, it's probably worth having. And Bill's point is, why would you not do it? He's saying he's not a financial professional, but he's saying, why would you at least not look into this if it's going to empower you to have a more fulfilling retirement? Things like that are what he's all about, saying you've got these tools in your toolkit. Use the ones that are going to be that are going to allow you to live the most meaningful life that you could live, while it is that you can live that meaningful life. Okay, so that was kind of principle number 4, which is how to comfortably spend money in retirement in an effort to have more of those meaningful experiences. The other one is a little bit controversial. It says, consider leaving your estate to your kids or your favorite charities while you are still alive. And this principle was written to address one of the common, one of the common arguments against dying with zero is people will say, well, what about my kids? What about the philanthropic things I want to do with the money that I leave in my estate? And Bill says, that's great. Go ahead and give your kids the money that you intend to give them now. What's stopping you from doing it now? And people really need to kind of work through that as a philosophical exercise. And some people say, well, I don't want my kids to feel like we have this weird relationship now. And he says, okay, well, why was it that you would want to wait till your kids are older and then just leave them a bunch of money when you're dead? Is it because you don't want to deal with the discomfort that might come from having to sit down and engage with your children on what you want to get out of your life? And he just finds that excuse not to be that good. He's saying, I don't buy it. I think that most people leave money to their children through their estate when they pass away, simply because that's what's been done, and that's what people intend on continuing to do. He says his point is there's not any real good reason for that, particularly with trust vehicles. And remember how the estate code works, or how this works. There's no real difference between giving gifts while you're alive versus giving gifts when you pass away. Those the estate tax threshold and the gift tax threshold, that's a unified system. So if you give some money away while you are alive, there's no gift tax due until you exceed that estate tax threshold. And even then, it's not due by the recipient of the gift. You can work it out that way, but most people don't. It wouldn't be due until you passed away, and just a smaller portion of your estate would pass tax-free at that time. So his point is, your kids are going to go through these periods of life where money is going to be much more meaningful to them than later in their life. And I can assure you that at the stage of your life where you're in your 30s, and if we can think about what happens to a person between, say, when they leave for college, which is when the first time they get any autonomy, and when they turn 30, most of their life happens during that 12 years. For most people, they go to college, they get their first job, they get married, and some people, even by the time they're 30, some others by the time they're 35, they start to have children. And I can assure you, money is very likely much tighter during that phase of their life and much more meaningful than it will be 30 years later when they are nearing their retirement of their own. Because if you, Mr. and Mrs. Client, prospective retiree, if you're 65 right now and you had kids when you were 30, your kids are already 35, right? And so by the time you plan on passing away, which is maybe when you're 80 or 90, they're going to be in their 50s or 60s. And a big bunch of money coming to them in their 50s and 60s, while it certainly doesn't mean nothing, it probably won't have as powerful an impact on their financial lives as it would if you were to just give the money you intended to leave them at your death to them while they were younger and while their finances were probably much tighter than they're going to be when they're in either their peak earnings years or entering retirement themselves. So like I said, that part of this book, that principle for dying with zero, is a little bit controversial. It's probably not for everybody to give your kids large gifts while you're still living. One of the things that some people worry about is whether or not their children will start to develop a dependency on these gifts. And Bill's point is, don't do an annual gift. Give it to them all at once in one lump sum and make it clear. This is your inheritance. You're just getting it now. Mom and dad are not the bank anymore. When we pass away, we intend to spend down our remaining assets, living the life that we want to live. But this was the portion of our estate we had intended on giving you anyway. Here you go. And I think that is going to intersect them at a much more meaningful part of their life. And the other half of that is you will actually be alive to see the difference that your generosity has made in their lives. Because when you give a gift to a person after you've passed, you don't get the experience of enjoying having been the person giving the gift. And remember, we talked about in Happy Money, one of the ways that they identified to best increase your happiness through how you spend your money was to give it away. And so from my perspective, you have this dead weight loss of happiness if you wait until you pass away to give a meaningful gift to your children, because one, they get the money at a less than optimal time to get it. And two, you don't get the experience of being the large gift giver while you can enjoy that experience. So those two sides of the coin, their happiness and yours, that's lost if you give the money away through the estate. So something to think about, probably not for everybody, but I felt like it was a powerful chapter, and it certainly made me reconsider how it was that I planned on doing my estate transfers. But we can move on to Principle 6. And Principle 6 is more of like it's a continuation kind of the philosophy. And what he says is, don't live life on autopilot. And these were my notes from that section. It said, the main gist of this section is reiterating the concept of consumption smoothing. So that is making sure that you're having experiences when you can best have those experiences rather than just delaying. So I actually in this, I reiterated some of that, but it says, in short, this means adopting the lifestyle that you can likely afford tomorrow, today, based on where your income is headed, rather than where your income currently rests. Now, how might this apply to your retiree? The concept is the same, if not more pressing. The active phase of your retirement begins when you officially retire, so that, maybe somewhere around 60 or 65, and extends to about age 75. Now, that's not going to be a universal term. We've just seen in our practice that by about age 75, particularly or especially by age 80, most of our clients have slowed down a lot. They're not doing as much international travel. They're not doing as many active things that require them to move their bodies. They're mostly kind of homebodies doing things with their grandkids in a way that's a little bit easier for them to do. So that's what I mean by the active phase of retirement, okay? And this is the whole ballgame. Failing to do the things that you want to do that require your physical health and vitality during this active phase mean you will have deferred them forever. You will not get another opportunity to be in your 60s. You will not get another opportunity to be in your early or in your late 50s. So keep that in mind when it comes to this consumption smoothing that Bill's talking about. Your tastes and preferences will likely change. Your capacity and tolerance for travel and more active endeavors, that will wane. A study through Vanguard actually demonstrated that spending, as a consequence of these changes in vitality and preferences, tends to decline through retirement. And that includes end-of-life care. Okay, so Vanguard didn't just study people who had the happy life like Betty White, where she was working and vital all the way through 90 and then went peacefully in her sleep. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about including end-of-life care. On average, spending actually declines through retirement as a consequence of these changes in preferences. So when you are young or when you are newly retired and not yet earning as much money, or if you don't just have as much money, consumption smoothing basically argues that we should essentially borrow against our future selves. So when retired, you're just doing the same thing, but you're just borrowing against what would otherwise be a very large estate that would just be passed to your heirs, charities, whomever else. And so that, again, reiterating not living life on autopilot is not just continuing to do the things that you did in your accumulation phase that allowed you to get to where you are today. You need to be a little bit more diligent about spending money. You need to be a little bit more proactive about how you're going to spend money, because now we're dealing with, between the age of 60 and maybe the age of 80, maybe the age of 75, a 15-year period where you're going to need to squeeze in a lot of the experiences that you're going to have in retirement now that you have the time to do them before your health starts to wane. Okay? Let's move on to Principle 7. This one is going to just add like a little bit of a roadmap through Principle 6, which is Bill argues that you should time block your life. Now, for the listener, this next part, these notes are not going to be that surprise. I have 7 children under the age of 10, and you guys have heard me say that many times. But I bring it up again because it demonstrates this principle pretty well. With young kids, especially kids as young as the twins who are now 6 months old, actually to the day they're 6 months old, there are a number of things that you can do with them only for what, in retrospect, feels like an extremely brief period. By the time your kids are 12, most parents will have spent 75% of all the time they're going to spend with their children has been spent by the time their kids are 12. Now, our oldest is about to be 10. So I have spent more than 50% of the time that I'm going to spend with this child for her whole life, in all likelihood, and she's only about to be 10. And our son just turned 5. So knowing that 75% of the time I'm going to get with my kids is between the time they are born and when they turn 12, that's incredible to me. That really paints this in an entirely different light. And I think by the time they're 18, you'll have spent close to 90 or 95% of the time that you're going to have spent with your kids for their lifetime. For their lifetime. So for me, this is just such a brief period. And I went on here and said, the twins are in such a period. Part of the evening routine for my wife and I is bathing them, getting them in their pajamas, and feeding them. Twins take bottles now, so we get the opportunity to be part of the feeding process. And there's something powerful about staring into my son's faces while they stare back at me, enthusiastically sucking down their milk. They're still small enough to be held in one arm and fed with the other. The gravity of this being the last time that we will get to do this with our own babies weighs heavily on me and my wife. From time to time, we hold them, we take in their sweet baby smells, knowing this chapter of our lives is going to close soon. While the finality is sad, it incites action. We find ourselves more willing to do the necessary and often unrewarding things that a parent must do. We could put a diaper on just about anything now, because we know, perversely, we will look back on the stage of life and we will miss it dearly. And we will. We'll look back on this period of our life and we'll miss it. We'll miss the changing the diapers. We'll miss the feeding of the babies. We'll miss the bathing of them. We'll miss looking down at their cute faces when we get them up from naps. We're really going to miss all that stuff. And I'm glad that we will, because if we miss it, it probably means that we spent it doing the things that we should have been doing. If we don't miss it, you probably just didn't get as much out of it as you should have. And the other thing that I know that what inevitably will come is they get older, they start walking, they start talking. So we try as much as we can to soak up all of the time we have with them while they're in this phase of life where we can still carry them around everywhere we need to go, feed them, do all the things that parents need to do. Bill then takes the idea of a bucket list, something you probably all have heard of, and reinvents it into the idea of time buckets. You see, a bucket list is generally something people don't get around to taking seriously until they are too close to the end of their life. By waiting this long to closely examine the things that you wish to accomplish or experience before the proverbial kick of the bucket, which is when you die, you might have missed out on experiences that are only available or far more pleasurable when you're young and healthy. So Bill first encourages the reader to make a list, as if money were of no issue at all, of all the things they can dream up that they might want to experience during their life. Don't worry about it being realistic. Just get these thoughts down. Once these experiences are written down, he argues you should sort them into time buckets. When would you get the most out of these experiences? Some can't be deferred. I can't take my son on an international trip for his 10th birthday when he turns 20. Some can. Maybe that trip to Disneyland with your family would have been made better off once the kids were a little bit older, or once you had the opportunity to save and budget a little bit more money for the trip. That's certainly possible. The point of the exercise is to get you thinking about the fleeting nature of your ability to fully enjoy some of these experiences. And this is obviously a theme that he returns to again and again. And this returns to a central premise of life optimization, the ongoing balance between current consumption and deferral, and understanding that your health and your time here on earth is limited. Bill points out that doors are continually closing. You are a kid once, an adolescent once, a college student once, an unattached 20-something with few obligations and no dependents once, a young parent once, newly married once or twice, and so on. Once these doors close, they can never be reopened except for in our memories. So again, we talked about this before with the marshmallow test and the kids who were brought in and those who could wait the 15 minutes until the person came back and have 2 marshmallows. They did better in life as measured by what can be quantified, the amount of money that they saved up, this kind of thing, how far they went in their careers. What is more difficult to quantify is whether or not when these people entered retirement, entered the final stages of their lives, whether or not they died with regrets about the things that they didn't do. And that is really what Bill is getting at here. He's trying to have people avoid that regret of looking back at the totality of their life and thinking about the things that they never got to do, even though they wanted to do them. Principle 8, Bill calls this knowing your peak. And for this principle, I actually have a couple of anecdotes and some thoughts on that. My dad, who's actually the most senior advisor on the team, was working with a client who hadn't yet retired. This client was an engineer and, to the surprise of no one, treated his retirement planning like an optimization problem. However, being the coldly rational engineer that he was, he narrowed the focus of this optimization problem to pure quantification. The question he posed to my dad was something along the lines of this: when should I retire if I want to spend the most I can possibly spend while still leaving the largest possible estate? My dad said he needed the afternoon to work on it and that he would call the client back in the morning. The client assured my dad he would do the same thing. So, as planned, Dad called the client back the next day. The client asked my dad if he had an answer. He said he did. The client had his answer as well. My dad revealed the optimal time to retire, subject to the parameters the client had expressed, was never. Our client, laughing a little bit to himself, sheepishly admitted he had come to the same conclusion. And this is kind of what Bill's getting at, saying, yes, if you purely quantify success in retirement as having the largest possible estate coupled with the largest possible consumption during your retirement period, you are inevitably going to end up in a place that says never, ever, ever stop earning an income. Because that way you're never amortizing your assets, you're never spending down what it is that you want to leave in your estate, and you have all the money that you want to spend during retirement. The part that is obviously conspicuously left out of this analysis is how the time was spent when you could have otherwise been retired. Obviously, we know it was spent working, and perhaps this is a job that he enjoyed. That would be great. But if it was a job he didn't enjoy, he needlessly worked for his entire career. Luckily, this isn't what the client ended up doing because he kind of came to his senses about this. But if you purely quantify retirement as success being you left a huge pile of money to your heirs, you're going to leave a lot of really great life experiences on the table. On another occasion, we had a couple come in to see us. It was evident in the first few minutes of the meeting that, we will call him John, was pretty agitated. As we closed out our prepared remarks, a bit of a peptic silence followed. John broke the silence saying that he felt like he couldn't hardly spend any money, that he felt like he was living paycheck to paycheck. We were puzzled. John actually had more money than when he retired. This is when his wife, let's call her Jane, chipped in. She said he never wants to see the number decline. So as our portfolio has increased in value, net of our spending, he gets anxious about seeing this new peak go away. My dad thought for a second, and then turning to John, he said, well, John, it seems like you've constructed a multi-million-dollar prison in which you can live out your retirement. Jane laughed. John didn't. Well, not at first anyway. But he softened when he realized the point was that the point of what my dad was saying, how he was needlessly kind of clinging to this new peak that his portfolio had managed to crest while being retired and spending the money that he wanted to spend. So even if he retired with $4 million, if he had accumulated $5, he wanted to be very cautious in the way that he spent his money so as to never see that number drop below $5 million again, which, as my dad pointed out, was not the point of being retired. That wasn't principally while they were there. He had all of our risk analysis told us that you can spend more money, you can spend the money that you want to spend, and you're not going to run out, but you certainly might have less than $5 million when you die. But as a reward for that, you'll have done all the things that you wanted to do. And so what Bill is getting at here is he breaks this down at having human capital and financial capital. So human capital, you can think of that as the present value of all the future earnings that you might accumulate over the rest of your career. That is what your human capital is. Your financial capital is all that income that you've actually turned into financial assets. So this could be your home, this could be your retirement portfolio, and this could be whatever other assets that you have on your balance sheet. Bill's point is our peak, and that comes when we combine human capital and financial capital of our net worth, probably comes a little bit earlier in life than most people anticipate. Here's what he means, is when you hit the peak earnings part of your career, maybe you're 50, you've got 10 or 15 years left in your until you retire, and by that point in time, you've probably accumulated some fairly significant financial assets outside of the remaining 15 years of your income. He's saying when you combine those two things, the present value of the income that you're going to earn over the last part of your career, plus all the financial capital that you've accumulated at that point in your life, he argues that that's when you should really start to spend down your assets. A couple of reasons for that. The first of which is you're young, you're healthy. You might still have some kids at home or who have just gone to college. you have the ability to do the things that you want to do while you're earning the most money while you have the most money that you probably ever should have in your life. He thinks that you should have your net worth peak when you can optimize that with health and vitality and remaining life expectancy. The other side of the coin is if you continue to defer those experiences and you hit your peak net worth when you die, you've foregone all those really great experiences that you could have had while you could have had them. And he wants to be very clear about this. He says it's fine to take some points off the scoreboard. If your whole scoreboard in life is just having a bunch of money sitting in an account, his point is you can't take it with you when you die anyway. So you need to go ahead and start taking some points off of that board and turning them into experiences that are going to pay you some memory dividends that are going to sustain you when you're in your 80s and 90s if you are lucky enough to live that far. And so weirdly enough, my sister and I are big fans of Jocko Willink. One of my sons is actually named after him. And almost in contrast to this prior thought, this was a note I was taking while reading this section of the book. Jocko has popularized this phrase, which is discipline equals freedom. And we love this phrase. My wife and I would try our best to live by it. It seems to fly in the face of Bill's philosophy of die with zero, which sounds brazenly irresponsible. But as we've covered here, he's not advocating for the sort of YOLO lifestyle more popular among the younger generations today. Quite the opposite. Discipline leading to freedom in this realm probably looks a little bit more like visiting with an advisor, going over your finances as granularly as you wish to go over them, running multiple spending scenarios, starting at different points in time with different longevity assumptions, with various rates of return and volatility assumptions, and seeing how feasible your spending goals are. For most disciplined savers, they actually discover that they can spend more money than they anticipated without materially increasing the risk of running out. This disciplined planning is often what yields anxiety-free spending. To shamelessly plug my own services, and I absolutely have no data to back this up, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to discover that those people who employ a financial advisor actually get more enjoyment and more utility out of their money, much like those who buy annuities, not because they necessarily have more to spend, but because they change the context in which they are spending their money. They have verified the robustness of their financial plan with an expert, and having done so, they spend the money they want to spend without the fear of running out. Okay? So the discipline equal freedom on our part does not mean the discipline that allowed you to get to where you are today as a retiree with plenty of money to spend is the same kind of discipline you should employ in your retirement. Quite the opposite. You should be just as diligent in your planning, but the outcome is anxiety-free spending, not how do we optimize our portfolio for more accumulation. It's how do we optimize our portfolio for anxiety-free and prudential decumulation. Okay? The last principle number 9 that Bill goes over is be bold but not foolish. And I think that that's great. And here's a great quote from Bill. But so many people don't take advantage of those times when they can easily take risks. And I think it's because they magnify the downside in their minds. They think of the absolute worst case scenario, like homelessness, even if such a scenario is not remotely realistic. As a consequence of this sort of fearful thinking, they don't recognize the asymmetry, much more upside than downside, in the risk that they are facing. In their minds, a disastrous failure looms larger than any kind of success. And the context within which Bill is speaking here is for young people who feel afraid of chasing down a dream or afraid of making irresponsible choices that might lead to what Bill assures his reader is little more than a temporary setback. And this has a lesson for retirees as well. We've harped on this podcast about how important it is to do the things that you want to do when you have the necessary health and physical capacity to do it. Many of our clients, however, live in this paralyzed state where they can't shake the image of being indigent and requiring the help of the state or their families in their waning years. It seems no amount of financial planning can, in some cases, fully assuage that worry. We have clients who come to us and ask what happens if the American economy ceases to exist. Our response is brief: don't call us. I have a set of skills, financial planning, that relies on the existence of a market-based economy. My skill set would be profoundly useless in a post-apocalyptic world. Now, why tell you that? The reason to tell you that is there is no financial plan. There is no plan that can account for all of the risks that we might face in this life. You can draw the short straw. You can get unlucky. You can be like Hannah and I's friend who had her life cut tragically short. That might happen. But it does you no good to spend a lot of your time worrying about such worst case scenarios, and it does you a lot of good to instead go about the business, the fun business, the really enriching business of creating memories that you're going to have from now until whenever it is that you leave here. So Bill Perkins, Die with Zero. It's a wonderful book. We covered some of the topics here, but there's way more in the book, and he does a much better job of walking you through these steps with the detail that you might need in order to start employing some of those strategies in your life. I highly recommend you read it, and stay tuned for the next episode.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co., Incorporated.